Our last video stopped with talking about time frames of evolution and using the fossil record to help understand how we might see different patterns of evolution. So we're trying to look for evidence that evolution has occurred, that organisms might be related. So if we have a hypothesis that we believe two organisms are related, what sort of evidence can we gather that would either support or refute that hypothesis? One of the types of evidence that we looked at was the fossil record. And we kept in mind that the fossil record is incomplete, inconsistent, but we can still use some evidence from the fossil record. And we ended with talking about this idea of, did a trait, shown here, evolve gradually through a series of small accumulation of changes, or did that trait dramatically emerge through a dramatic type of mutation? And the interesting thing is that when we look at this trait, we're looking at a physical trait, and we're trying to understand where did this physical trait come from. And historically, natural selection and evolution has focused on what we call anatomical structure, so physical traits. So we want to move now into talking about what evidence does anatomical structures provide? And so first we want to understand that anatomy could be, for example, bone structure. And that's kind of one of the main ones that we look at, is the physical structure of the organism. And so, interestingly enough, if we asked people about bats, birds, and insects, we have to be very aware of what does that mean? What does that structure actually mean? And now that we know a little bit more about DNA and how those structures came to be, we can really start to understand why a bat and a bird are more closely related than a bird and an insect are. All three of these are wings. And so we have two different phrases to describe how similar these structures are. So if I'm trying to compare who is more related, a bat, a bird, or an insect, and I'm looking at structures, I have to look at it through the right lens, not just on the surface what it looks like. And so we have what are called homologous or homology relationships. This means that they are going to be similar in structure, but they may serve different functions. What we want to focus on is this idea of if they are similar in structure. If they are built the same, that probably means that the code for building them is similar. Well, anytime we talk about a code in biology, really what we're talking about is DNA. And so a pair of homologous structures tells us that the code is similar, but the organism might be living in different environments. So the organisms may inhabit different environments. And therefore use those structures differently. So an interesting example is a whale, a cat, a horse, and a human. If we look at the bone arrangement of the arm, now we see it as an arm. In a cat and a horse, we would probably call it a leg. In a whale, we're probably going to call it a flipper. But it turns out that if you look at the arrangement, you're going to see some interesting similarities in the structure. We're going to see a large amount of small bones. So when we look at our carpals, our metacarpals, we have lots of small bones together, and that's what forms our finger. And we see that in a couple of different organisms. We also see two kind of parallel bones, and that's your radius and your ulna. And then you've got the humerus, which is up here, this kind of top arm bone. And so interestingly enough, what we see is that these four organisms have a very similar bone arrangement. So the structure is the same or similar, but the function is very different. A whale is going to use these bones to help it swim. A cat is going to use these bones to help it walk or locomote, similar with a horse. If we even look at a bat, we see a kind of similar bone arrangement as well. The human, we don't use our arms to locomote. We use our arms to manipulate our environment. And so what we see, what homology or homologous structures tell us, is that even though we don't use them for the same thing anymore, that they were coded for by similar DNA codes. And what this means is this is evidence for a common ancestor. Meaning at some point there was an organism that had a bone arrangement that as that organism changed over time and radiated out into different environments, that organism used that structure differently. So that's homologous structures or homology, where the structure is similar, but how it's used by the organism really depends on the environmental selection forces. The next pattern that we sometimes see is the one that I will call the misleading pattern. I think it looks the same, but it's actually not that similar. Analogous structures are going to be similar in function, like helping you fly through the air, but different in structure. Which means that the code is different. And this is a beautiful example, the bat, the bird, and the insect wing. All of these structures are going to help this organism inhabit a different environment. They're all going to survive by moving through the air, living in the upper part of a biome. And so what we see with the bat is that it had an arm. It's a mammal. Bats are mammals, remember. It had an arm, but any bats that had longer fingers and webbing between those fingers actually had an advantage. So over time, and you can almost see it when you look at this little flying marsupial down in this next picture, what we see with analogous structures is the idea that there are many different ways to here fly, and that all of them are successful, but that doesn't mean that they had a common ancestor. So analogous structures do not mean there was a common ancestor. It does mean that they had common environmental selection forces. So when I look at this example again, the bat and the bird and the insect, the bat and the bird would share a more recent common ancestor. Now, remember we've said that it's likely that all living things share a common ancestor somewhere, and so we do want to kind of add in this idea of recent, not a very recent common ancestor, meaning that structure didn't come from the common ancestor that they last shared. This structure evolved after those organisms diverged. We'll talk about that in just a second. But the idea with analogous structures is they do the same job, but the code is so different. They're actually built very differently. So the bat and the bird are both based on bones covered in skin. The bat's skin has a large surface area. The bird has a small surface area skin, but then a larger surface area with the feathers. The insect is completely different. These are protein-based. There's no bone. They're not living at that point. A muscle will move the wing, just like in both of these, but it is not from a common, the idea of the wing, the structure is not common from the ancestor that once shared these three animals. And so this is where we start to get into the idea of, well, what led to analogous structures? What led to homologous structures? All of it has to do with the idea of common ancestors. And so we've got three kind of patterns to look at. The first is going to look at what we call divergent evolution. And this is where there is and we call this an MRCA, most recent common ancestor. A most recent common ancestor, and the organisms diverged, and now they're a little bit different. So when we look at the cat and the horse, they shared a common ancestor. That common ancestor had that type of bone arrangement. And then as the cat and the horse diverged over time, living in different environments, of course at that point they weren't a cat and a horse. They evolved in different paths, and that's how we got to the cat and the horse. And so it's this idea that you did share a common ancestor for specific structures. The next idea is called convergent evolution. And convergent evolution is where two very different parent species experienced a similar environment, and those pressures led them to similar structures. And so analogous structures are really the result of convergent evolution. We've got all these different animals living on Earth, and some are trying to live in the upper parts of trees, and different advantages and the accumulations of those advantages led to wings, but just from very different routes. So they started in different origins, did not share a common ancestor, but managed to somehow, through selective pressure, the organisms that survived had similar functional parts of their anatomy. The final one is called parallel. And parallel evolution is going to be where you experience similar sort of selection forces. So if we have a cheetah who might eat antelope one day and zebras the next day, the antelope and the zebras are going to experience similar pressures. But the responses and who was selected has no relationship. And so one kind of final example, and this is an example of parallel evolution, is the idea that in different parts of the world, we've got parallel patterns. And so this is with marsupial animals. These are going to be animals that actually carry their young in pouches. And we'll see them in different parts of the world. So these are marsupial animals in Australia. And these are marsupial animals in the Americas. And they experience similar pressures. They don't have a recent common ancestor. The other parts that we want to get to when we talk about structures are vestigial and imperfect. And so when we look at vestigial structures are structures that once had a function. But no longer necessary. But there is also no disadvantage, and therefore no pressure against that structure. So we can talk about things like wisdom teeth in humans. We can talk about the appendix. But a really interesting one is that the whale actually has a pelvic bone. And this is actually evidence that the whale evolved from land mammals, such as the cow. And this pelvic bone does nothing. The whale doesn't have legs. It doesn't have femurs attached to the pelvis. But there's no selective pressure against that bone, no disadvantage. So the whale still has that. And so we'll look at this a little bit more in the case studies that you're going to look at in class. We'll also talk more about imperfect structures and how to track structures over time.